The gavel came down so hard it split the silence of the Harrow Creek meeting hall like a rifle shot, and Emma Merriweather stood at the center of it all, alone. She had known this moment was coming. She had felt it gathering the way a storm gathers over the dry Kansas plain, slow at first, then all at once, until the sky turns the color of a bruise and there is nowhere left to run. But knowing a thing is coming does not make it easier to stand inside it when it finally arrives. Sheriff Dale Purdy was already on his feet, one thick finger pointed straight at her chest, his face the dark red of a man who believed his own righteousness so completely it had become indistinguishable from cruelty. Around him sat nearly every person of consequence in Harrow Creek, Kansas, in the late spring of 1882. Merchants, landowners, the town pastor, the school teacher, the women from the Civic Beautification Society who had never once spoken a kind word to Emma but had never needed to, because silence in Harrow Creek carried its own particular weight. "The evidence is plain," Sheriff Purdy said, and his voice filled the hall the way filth fills a barrel, slowly, completely, leaving no room for clean air. Emma Merriweather forged the deed to the Stiller property. She conspired to steal water rights that belonged to the families of this town. And I am asking every man and woman in this room to say so, because what we decide here tonight will determine the fate of this community. A murmur moved through the crowd. Not one person stood up for her. Not one voice rose in her defense. Emma kept her chin level. She had taught herself that years ago, in a different town under different cruelties, and the habit had not left her. She would not look at the floor. She would not let them see her break. "Does anyone in this room have a word to say in this woman's defense?" the sheriff asked, and the contempt in his voice made the word woman sound like an accusation. The silence that followed was the most devastating thing Emma had ever experienced. She had thought she had built something here in Harrow Creek, a small livelihood, a small reputation, a small life. She had been a fool to think that small was enough to protect her. And then, from the back of the room, a chair scraped across the plank floor. Boots struck the wood slowly, deliberately, with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once needed to rush to be heard. Simon Walden stood up, and he spoke her name. "Emma Merriweather," he said, and the two words landed in that room like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples outward in every direction, "is the most honest person in this county. And I will say so under oath before God or before any court in the state of Kansas." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And in that frozen moment, everything that had been building between Emma Merriweather and Simon Walden over the past 4 months came rushing back to her all at once, every moment of it sharp as cut glass and twice as dangerous. It had begun, as so many things in the West began, with a letter. Emma had arrived in Harrow Creek the previous November, on a wagon that smelled of pine resin and wet wool, with a carpetbag that held everything she owned, and a folded contract in the breast pocket of her traveling coat. She was 27 years old, a widow by circumstance if not by marriage, and she had answered an advertisement in the Topeka Daily Capital posted by a man named Gerald Stiller, who required a capable woman to manage the books and correspondence of his small cattle operation, located 3 miles outside of Harrow Creek. She was not a mail-order bride, though more than one person in town had assumed so and made no particular effort to hide their assumption. She was an educated woman with a head for numbers and a history she did not share with strangers, and Gerald Stiller had hired her because she came with references from 2 cattle outfits in Missouri and 1 land office in Nebraska, all of which attested to her competency, her discretion, and her absolute reliability with figures. Gerald Stiller himself had turned out to be a gentle, white-haired man of 62 who moved slowly through the world and thought even more slowly, which Emma had quickly discovered was not a flaw but a quality. He weighed things carefully. He did not speak until he was certain of what he meant. And he had been, in the 4 weeks she knew him before the autumn cold settled into his chest and turned into something worse, genuinely kind to her in a way that did not expect anything in return. She had sat with him through December as the cold deepened and his breathing grew labored, reading aloud to him from a dog-eared copy of Ivanhoe he kept on his nightstand, managing the books and correspondence as she had been hired to do, and watching with a quiet dread the way the life was slowly leaving a good man's body. Gerald Stiller died on the 14th of January, 1882, during a night so cold the water in the wash basin froze solid, and Emma had been the only person in the house. He left her the property, not because of any dark motive on her part, not because of any manipulation or conspiracy of the kind Sheriff Purdy was now loudly asserting to the people of Harrow Creek. Gerald Stiller left Emma Merriweather his property because he had no living family, because she had been kind to him in his last weeks without requiring kindness in return, and because he had told her himself, on a Sunday afternoon when the pale winter light came through the window and he could still speak in full sentences, that a piece of land needed someone who would love it, and he believed she was capable of that. She had the will. She had the deed, transferred and recorded with the county clerk in the presence of a notary. She had done everything correctly, in plain daylight, with witnesses and signatures, and every piece of paper that the law required. None of that had mattered to Sheriff Dale Purdy, because what the sheriff actually wanted was the water. The Stiller property sat at the intersection of two seasonal creek beds that fed into the primary water source for the eastern ranches of Harrow Creek County. In a dry year, which most years in Kansas were becoming, that water was worth more than the cattle it fed. It was worth more than the land itself. It was worth more than anyone's good opinion of a woman who had arrived from somewhere else with a carpetbag and no family connections and no husband to speak for her. The sheriff had a partner, a land speculator from Wichita named Theodore Crane, who had been trying to acquire the Stiller property for 2 years before Gerald died. When the property went to Emma instead, the plan shifted. Purdy and Crane could not simply buy her out because she had no reason to sell. So they decided to take it. Emma had not understood all of this in November, or in December, or even in January when Gerald died. She had understood it slowly, the way you understand weather, by watching patterns repeat until the pattern becomes unmistakable. She had understood it completely by March, which was when she first had a real conversation with Simon Walden. Simon Walden's spread, the Walden Ranch, ran along the northern edge of county for approximately 4,000 acres, making it the second largest cattle operation in the region after the consolidated holdings of the Crane Land Company, which was a fact that Simon was well aware of, and which he took no particular pride in, because he understood that size without character was just emptiness with better fencing. He was 34 years old in the spring of 1882, a tall man with dark hair going silver at the temples and eyes the color of the Kansas sky in October, that particular shade of blue-gray that carried both warmth and distance in equal measure. He had built the Walden Ranch from 200 acres and a single breeding pair of Hereford cattle into something his father, who had died of a fever in 1874, would not have recognized. He had done it through work and intelligence, and a quality that people in Harrow Creek mistook for coldness, but was actually only discernment. Simon Walden did not spend his trust freely, and he did not pretend to relationships he did not feel. He had known Gerald Stiller well. Not intimately, but well, in the way that neighbors in wide country know each other, through shared fence lines and water disputes and the occasional agreement over livestock prices and the more occasional bottle of whiskey on a porch at sundown. He had heard about Emma Merriweather before he met her. In a town the size of Harrow Creek, it was impossible not to. The gossip had been, in the way of small-town gossip, simultaneously excessive and entirely uninformative. She was a widow or she was not. She had come from Missouri or from Ohio or possibly from somewhere worse. She had designs on the Stiller property before the old man was in the ground, or she had merely been in the right place at the right time. She was respectable or she was not, and the uncertainty of that last point was, in the estimation of the Harrow Creek Civic Beautification Society, the most troubling thing of all. Simon had no patience for any of it. He had met enough people in his life to know that character revealed itself slowly and surely, and that the people who formed opinions fastest were almost always the people whose opinions were worth the least. He met Emma Merriweather on the first Monday of March, at the county clerk's office in town, where they had both arrived independently to file paperwork related to spring water agreements. The county clerk, a flustered young man named Patterson, who always seemed to be one document away from total bureaucratic collapse, had managed to mix their files together in a way that required both of them to sit in the small waiting area and sort through papers while he located the correct records. Emma had been the one to notice the error first. She had laid the papers on the wooden bench between them, sorted them with quick, efficient hands, and said, without looking up, "These 3 are yours. The rest are mine." Simon had looked at her then, because the voice was calm and the hands were certain, and those two qualities together in a person always arrested his attention. She was not what he had expected, which had irritated him slightly because he preferred not to have expectations. She was dark-haired and direct-eyed, with a face that had seen weather and work and had not softened in response to either, but had achieved instead a kind of honest beauty that required no apology and invited no interpretation. She wore a practical gray dress and boots that had actual mud on them, which meant she had been walking the property rather than sitting indoors, and there was an ink stain on the first 2 fingers of her right hand that told him she had been writing something this morning before she came to town. "Thank you," he said. She glanced up then, assessed him with the quick directness of a person who had learned to read situations fast, and said, "You're Simon Walden." "I am," he said. "Gerald spoke well of you," she said, and then she returned to her papers with the air of someone who had delivered the relevant information and saw no need to ornament it. That was the whole of their first conversation. But Simon Walden, driving back to his ranch through the cold March air, found himself thinking about her twice before supper, and 3 times after, and by morning he had admitted to himself with his customary bluntness that he found Emma Merriweather considerably more interesting than he had found anything in several years. The second conversation happened 2 weeks later, and it was not a conversation so much as a confrontation, because by then the situation with Sheriff Purdy had begun its escalation into something that could not be ignored. Emma had ridden into town to discover that the deed to the Stiller property had been quietly challenged at the county level, with a filing claiming the original transfer was fraudulent on the grounds that Gerald Stiller had been of unsound mind when the will was drawn. The filing had been submitted anonymously, but the hand behind it was not difficult to identify, because Theodore Crane had been seen in the county clerk's office the previous week, and because Sheriff Purdy's brother-in-law happened to be an attorney in the county seat who specialized in property challenges. Emma had been standing outside the clerk's office, the challenge documents in her hand, her jaw set in a line of controlled fury, when Simon rode past and, against his usual custom of not inserting himself into other people's situations without invitation, stopped his horse. He had read the situation in her face and in the papers and said simply, "How bad is it?" she had told him. Not with drama, not with appeals for sympathy, but plainly and precisely as she told everything, and he had listened in the same fashion, and when she finished he said, "The water rights, that's what this is about." "Yes," she said. "Gerald told me he'd never sell those water rights to Crane," Simon said. "I heard him say it twice in front of witnesses." "Would those witnesses say so?" Emma asked. Simon had paused because it was a real question and it deserved a real answer. "2 of them might," he said carefully. "The third is in Crane's pocket." She had nodded as though this confirmed something she had already calculated. Then she looked at him directly and said, "Why are you telling me this?" He had thought about that for a moment, because it was a fair question and he owed her a fair answer. "Because Gerald trusted me enough to tell me things he didn't tell other people," he said at last, "and because he trusted you enough to leave you everything he had." "That says something I take seriously." Something shifted in her expression. Not softness exactly, but a kind of recalibration, the way a person looks when they have been braced for one thing and receive something unexpected instead. "I don't need rescuing," she said clearly. "I know that," he said. "I'm not offering rescue. I'm offering information. Those are different things." She had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had folded the documents carefully and put them in her coat pocket and said, "Then I would hear what else you know, Mr. Walden, if you're willing to share it." "I'm willing," he said. They had ridden out of town side by side, and the conversation that followed had lasted 4 hours, during which time Emma learned that the attempted challenge to Gerald's will was likely the first step in a campaign designed to wear her down financially through legal costs until she either sold or abandoned the property. That Crane had attempted similar maneuvers twice before in the county and had succeeded once, and that Sheriff Purdy had been quietly accepting payments from Crane for at least 2 years. A secret known to several people in Harrow Creek, and apparently actionable by none of them. And Simon had learned that Emma Merriweather had come from Cincinnati originally, had been married at 22 to a man who turned out to be neither the person she thought nor particularly inclined to remain married once he understood she would not be managed, had left that marriage through legal means that cost her nearly everything she owned, and had spent the years since rebuilding her financial independence through exactly the kind of careful, competent work that had brought her to Gerald Stiller's doorstep. "You've been carrying a great deal," he said when she had finished. "Everyone carries something," she said, with the slight sharpness of someone who finds pity more uncomfortable than hardship. "The question is whether it breaks you or teaches you." "And which has it done for you?" he asked. She had considered that question with the seriousness it deserved. The afternoon light was flat and gold on the open grass around them, and somewhere to the south a hawk was riding a thermal in slow circles, and Emma Merriweather sat her horse with perfect steadiness and said, "Both, I think." "At different times." Simon looked at the horizon then, because something in the honesty of that answer had caught him somewhere behind his ribs in a way that required a moment to absorb. "That's the truest answer I've ever heard to that question," he said. They rode back toward town in a silence that was not uncomfortable, and at the fork where the road divided toward his ranch and hers, they stopped their horses and looked at each other in the last light of the afternoon. "I'm going to fight this," Emma said. It was not a declaration to him so much as a statement of fact made aloud to crystallize it. "I know," he said, and then, after a pause, "you won't be fighting it alone." She had looked at him steadily. "That remains to be seen," she said, but she had ridden home less tightly wound than she had arrived, and that he thought was something. April in Kansas came with mud and wind and the particular restlessness of animals who had been penned too long by winter, and were not yet entirely certain what to do with the returning warmth. Emma threw herself into the work of the Stiller property with an energy that her 2 ranch hands, brothers named Carl and Joseph Haynes, found both admirable and slightly exhausting. The water challenge wound its way through the county bureaucracy with the grinding slowness of all legal processes, but Emma had engaged a lawyer of her own, a sharp-minded woman named Clara Boyd who had set up practice in the county seat and who specialized, as she put it, in cases where the law was being used as a weapon against the people it was meant to protect. Clara Boyd had looked at the challenge filing, looked at Emma's documents, and said with quiet satisfaction, "This is fabricated." The signature witnesses on the challenge claimed to have witnessed Gerald Stiller's mental incapacity, but both of them were in Topeka during the period in question. "I can prove that with railroad records and hotel ledgers." "How long will it take?" Emma had asked. 3 months, Clara said. "Maybe 4. 3 months was a long time when someone was actively trying to undermine your position in a community that had not yet decided what it thought of you. 3 months was a long time when the town sheriff was making pointed remarks about forgery at the barber shop and the dry goods store and anywhere else he could find a captive audience. 3 months was a long time when the Civic Beautification Society had quietly stopped acknowledging you on the street, and the pastor had delivered 2 successive sermons on the theme of outsiders who came to take what belonged to the community. Emma endured it the way she endured everything, by working. She was up before dawn, on the property, making the Stiller land into something that could sustain itself regardless of what the courts decided. She repaired fences. She negotiated with the cattle buyer in Abilene to get a fair price for the spring herd. She mapped the creek beds with the meticulous accuracy of someone who understood that knowledge of the land was itself a form of ownership, and she began to understand better than anyone else in the county exactly what the water on the Stiller property was worth. Simon came to call on the second Saturday of April, which was not something he had planned exactly, but which had seemed, on that particular morning, like the most natural thing to do. He told himself it was because he had information about a fence line dispute that bordered both their properties. He told himself this with the straightforward dishonesty of a man who is not yet ready to admit what is actually happening. Emma had been sitting at the kitchen table when he knocked, surrounded by ledgers and maps, her dark hair pinned back in her reading glasses, which she removed quickly when she opened the door, tucked into the pocket of her work dress. "Mr. Walden," she said, with a slight raising of her brows that conveyed both surprise and inquiry without committing to either. "I was in the area," he said, which was technically true and spiritually preposterous, because the Walden Ranch was 3 miles in the other direction. She had looked at him for a moment with an expression that he was beginning to recognize as her version of amusement, a very small shift at the corner of her mouth that stopped just short of an actual smile. "Would you like coffee?" she asked. He would. He stayed for 2 hours. They talked about the water rights and the legal challenge and the county political situation, because those were the legitimate reasons for the visit. But they also talked about other things, because 2 people sitting at a kitchen table in mid-April with coffee going cold between them will talk about other things eventually, regardless of what brought them to the table in the first place. He told her about his father, who had come west from Virginia with nothing but a horse and a belief in the particular dignity of honest work. She told him about Cincinnati, and about the parts of the city that never made it into the newspaper accounts, the narrow streets where people like her family had lived, neither poor enough to be notable nor comfortable enough to be safe from the kind of financial reversal that could happen overnight when your income depended on a husband's choices. He told her that he had been engaged once, 10 years ago, to a woman named Ruth who had decided sensibly that she preferred Philadelphia to Kansas. She had waited until he was back from a cattle drive to tell him, which he had always thought was at least considerate if not kind. Emma had listened to this with the close attention she gave everything and said, "Did it hurt?" "Yes," he said with the directness she seemed to bring out in him, "for about a year, and then it was just the truth of things." She nodded. "The truth of things," she repeated quietly as though tasting the phrase. "What was his name?" he asked. "Your husband." "Henry Merriweather," she said. And then, with a precision that told him she had thought about this enough to reduce it to its essential shape, he was handsome and charming, and he believed that those 2 qualities excused everything else, including lying about money and lying about other women. When I filed for divorce, he told everyone in Cincinnati that I had lost my sanity, which was a useful fiction because it meant no one had to examine his behavior. "I'm sorry," Simon said. "I'm not," she said, with a firmness that he believed completely. "Not anymore. The marriage cost me a great deal, but it also taught me exactly what I was capable of. You sometimes need the disaster to discover the resource." He had looked at her across the table, at the directness of her eyes and the steadiness of her and the ink stains still on her fingers from the morning's work, and felt something in his chest that he was going to have to reckon with eventually. He left before he said anything about it, because he was, at his core, a careful man, and the situation she was in required care from him, not complication. But he rode home thinking about her with an intensity that told him The reckoning was not going to wait as long as he might prefer. May arrived, and the legal situation worsened before it improved. Theodore Crane came to town personally, which was unusual enough to mean something, and he held a meeting at the hotel with the town's major property owners. Emma was not invited, but Carl Haynes's younger brother worked at the hotel and reported back that Crane had described the water rights dispute as a matter of community survival and had suggested, in terms that were diplomatically oblique but practically clear, that the community's best interests lay in supporting the claim that Emma's deed was fraudulent. After that meeting, things in Harrow Creek shifted. Merchants who had been neutral became cool. The banker, who had been processing her routine accounts without comment, suddenly found reasons to hold her deposits for extended review. Two of the ranchers who had been buying water access from the Stiller property discontinued their agreements without explanation, costing her a significant portion of her operating income. It was, Emma recognized, a coordinated campaign, and it was working. She told Simon about it on a Wednesday evening when he had ridden over ostensibly to discuss a shared fence repair and had stayed, as he always seemed to stay these days, well past the point where the fence could be the real reason. "They're trying to starve you out," Simon said. "Yes," she said. "Then we need to change the economic equation," he said. He had been thinking about it since he heard about Crane's meeting. "The water agreements you lost, I'll take them on. You sell me the water access at the same rate you were selling the others, and I'll route it back to the ranchers who have been pressured to drop you. They get what they need without going around Crane, and you keep the income." Emma had looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, a complicated kind of stillness that was not quite suspicion and not quite gratitude but something in between, something that was trying to determine what he wanted in exchange for this. "And what does this cost me?" she asked. "Nothing," he said quietly. "That's not how I operate. Everyone wants something," she said, and the words were not unkind so much as they were deeply trained into her by experience. Simon was quiet for a moment because that deserved honesty, not reassurance. "I won't tell you that I don't care about you," he said at last, "because I do. But I'm not offering this as a trade for something you haven't chosen to give. I'm offering it because it's the right thing to do and because I have the means to do it and because letting Crane and Purdy win would be wrong." He paused. "Those are all the reasons. You can take them or leave them." She looked at him for a long, still moment. Outside, the evening wind moved through the new grass and the light was going gold and low across the flat land. Emma Merriweather, who had learned to be careful with trust the way you are careful with a thing that has burned you before, was very quiet. "All right," she said. "I'll take them." The arrangement worked. More than worked. Over the following weeks, the water income stabilized. Clara Boyd was making progress with the railroad records that would demolish the challenge to Gerald's will. And something else was happening too. Something that neither Emma nor Simon had exactly planned, but that had been building with the slow, undeniable pressure of a western spring, where the warmth comes in gradually, and then all at once, and everything that has been frozen starts to move. He was at her property 3 times a week by the end of May. Ostensibly for the water agreement, for the fence repair, for the various practical matters of neighboring ranches. And they did attend to those things, with the same focused competence they brought to everything. But they also sat on the porch in the long evenings and talked, and the talking had grown into something that had no practical purpose at all, which was how they both knew it was real. He told her about the land, about what it felt like to watch a single property become something that could endure, not just survive but genuinely endure, across seasons and droughts and market fluctuations, and every other calamity that the West could produce. She listened with the quality of attention she gave everything, asking precise questions that revealed how much she had already understood and how much more she wanted to know. She told him about the ledgers, about the hidden satisfaction of bringing a set of disorganized accounts into perfect order, about the way numbers told the truth about a business the way nothing else could. He listened and asked his own questions, and somewhere in the middle of one of these conversations, she looked up and found him watching her face, and the expression she found there was so unguarded and so clear that it made her breath catch. "Simon," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," she said, and her own voice surprised her. He crossed the porch to where she was sitting in 2 slow steps, and when he reached out and took her hand, it was with the same care he gave everything, deliberate and warm and utterly certain. She looked down at their joined hands for a moment and then back up at him, and what she saw in his face was not the charming performance she had learned to distrust in Henry Merriweather. It was something much simpler and much more frightening, because it was true. She turned her hand over in his and held it back. "We should be careful," she said, not because she wanted to be. Because she knew what the town would make of it, and she was already the woman with the dark past and the forged deed and the suspicious water rights. "We can be careful," he said, "and still be honest about what this is." She looked at him steadily. "And what is this?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, with the precision she had come to trust completely. "Something I haven't felt before," he said. "Which is saying something, because I'm not a young man and I've felt a fair number of things." The sound that came out of her then surprised them both. It was not quite a laugh, but it was something in the direction of one, and it undid something in her face that had been held carefully for a long time. "You are the least romantic man I have ever met," she told him. "That's probably true," he said with a slight smile. "Is it a problem?" She looked at him. "No," she said. "It really isn't." June was the month when the pressure from Sheriff Purdy moved into open hostility. 3 things happened in quick succession that week that made Emma understand the campaign against her had moved into its final phase. First, the county clerk received a second filing, this one alleging that Emma had bribed the notary who had witnessed the original deed transfer. This was fabricated, as Clara Boyd confirmed within 24 hours, but it required immediate response and cost Emma 2 days of frantic document gathering. Second, one of the Haynes brothers, Carl, came to her on a Tuesday morning with his hat in his hands and a look of profound misery on his face, and told her that his family's winter loan was held by the Harrow Creek Bank, and that the bank had informed him the loan would be called early unless he left her employment. Carl Haynes had worked for Gerald Stiller for 9 years. He was, Emma knew, completely aware of what he was being asked to do and completely unable to refuse it, because his family, which included a wife and 3 children and an elderly mother, depended on that loan to get through to the fall harvest. She had released him without blame, and then she had sat in the kitchen alone for a long time, feeling the shape of what was happening to her with a clarity that was almost physical. Third, that same week, she had ridden into town for supplies and been told at the dry goods store that her credit, which she had never once failed to pay in full, was no longer extended. She had paid in cash from her diminishing reserve and ridden home with the feeling that the walls were closing in. Simon had come that evening and found her on the porch with her ledgers and the look on her face of someone doing a calculation whose answer they do not like. "Tell me," he said. She told him all of it, every detail without softening it. He listened with his face very still, and she watched him absorb the scope of what Purdy and Crane were doing with an anger that he controlled the way he controlled everything completely, but she could see it in the set of his jaw and the careful way he placed his words. "They're not going to stop," he said. "No," she said. "They're going to force a public confrontation. That's what the filings are building toward. They want a public moment where the town has to choose, and they've arranged it so the town will choose against me." "Then we need to be ready for that moment," Simon said. "We," she said, and she looked at him with the direct, honest gaze that he had come to think of as the most trustworthy thing he knew. "Simon, when that moment comes, standing with me is going to cost you. Crane controls the eastern water access for 3 of your northern pastures. If he decides to make your life difficult in response, he can do it." "I know that," he said. "I'm not asking you to sacrifice your ranch for me," she said, and there was something in her voice that was trying very hard to be practical and struggling. He looked at her. "You're not asking me to do anything," he said. "I'm choosing to." "Why?" she asked. Not because she doubted him, because she needed to hear it said. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke it was with the same simplicity that she had come to recognize as the truest register of who he was. "Because you are the best person I have met in a long time," he said. "Because what's happening to you is wrong and I have the means to stand against it, and choosing not to because it's convenient would make me into someone I don't want to be." He paused. "And because I love you, which is a separate reason and also the most important one." The words fell into the evening air between them, plain and unhurried, and Emma sat very still inside them. "Simon," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "I know it's not the right time," he said. "There's no right time, actually, and I decided I was done waiting for one." She stood up from her chair and came to him, and he opened his arms and she walked into them, and he held her in the quiet Kansas evening with the solid, certain warmth of a man who had nothing left to prove. She pressed her face against his shoulder and felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, completely safe. "I love you too," she said into the fabric of his shirt. "I've been trying not to for approximately 2 months. His arms tightened around her. "How has that been going?" he asked with the dry near humor that she had come to love. "Poorly," she said. They stood like that for a long time, while the last of the light faded over the Kansas plain, and the first stars appeared, and the creek beds on the Stiller property murmured with the water that everyone wanted and nobody, except Emma Merriweather, was going to fight for correctly. The meeting in the town hall was called by Sheriff Purdy on the last Friday of June, advertised as a community forum on water rights and public land use, which was the kind of innocuous description that ensured maximum attendance while concealing the actual purpose, which was the public accusation and social destruction of Emma Merriweather. Simon knew it was coming. Emma knew it was coming. Clara Boyd, who had been working 16-hour days on the legal case and was now very close to having the evidence she needed, knew it was coming and had urged Emma to delay, to not give Purdy the public stage he was seeking. Emma had thought about it carefully. She had sat with Simon on the porch the evening before and weighed every consideration, and at the end of it she had said, "If I don't show up, they'll use my absence as evidence of guilt. If I do show up, I face whatever they've prepared. But at least if I'm there, I can speak. Whatever happens in that room," Simon said, "I'll be there." "I know," she said. And she had leaned into his shoulder, and he had pressed his lips to her hair, and they had sat together in the gathering dusk like two people who have found something rare and are quietly certain they will protect it. The meeting hall was full to its walls when Emma walked in on Friday evening. Every chair was taken and people were standing along the sides, which told her that Purdy had been effective in building his audience. She walked to the front of the room with her chin level and took a seat at the table that had been set there for the meeting's so-called participants, which consisted of herself, Sheriff Purdy, and a county official she did not recognize who had been brought in from the county seat. Theodore Crane was in the front row of the audience. He was a compact man in an expensive coat, with the self-satisfied expression of someone who has invested in an outcome and is confident of collecting. He did not look at her. The charges Purdy laid out were the culmination of everything he had been building for months, presented with the structure of formal accusation, but the passion of a man who believed, or had told himself often enough that he believed, in what he was saying. Forgery of the deed. Conspiracy to defraud. The assertion that Emma had manipulated a dying old man into signing property over to her through a combination of calculated affection and deliberate isolation. Every accusation was delivered with the total confidence of someone who knows the audience is already prepared to accept it, and Emma watched the faces of the people in the room and saw the acceptance, the nodding, the exchanged glances. These were people who had known Gerald Stiller for years, who had never once troubled themselves to visit him in his last months, but who were now prepared to be outraged on his behalf. She made her response when Purdy finished. She spoke clearly and without emotion, because emotion was the trap they had set for her, the image of the hysterical woman whose protestations confirmed her guilt. She presented the facts as facts, the dates, the names of the witnesses. The legal process followed precisely. Clara Boyd was not present tonight, but Emma had her documents, and she laid them out one by one with the steady hands of a woman who had been managing books and correspondence since she was 19 years old, and who understood that the truth, properly documented, could withstand a great deal of pressure. When she finished, Purdy said the thing she had been expecting, which was that anyone could manufacture documents, and that the question before the community was not merely legal but moral, and that the moral question was whether the people of Harrow Creek would stand for an outsider stealing water that belonged to their families. And then he had said the words that opened the trap all the way. "Does anyone in this room have a word to say in this woman's defense?" The silence had been absolute. Emma had looked at the faces around her, one by one, the faces of people she had tried to become part of, to contribute to belong among, and she had felt the specific grief of understanding that belonging had never really been available to her in this room, that they had already decided before they came through the door. And then the chair scraped, and the boots struck the floor, and Simon Walden stood up at the back of the room and spoke her name. "Emma Merriweather," he said, and every head in the room turned, "is the most honest person in this county, and I will say so under oath before God or before any court in the state of Kansas." He walked to the front of the room with the unhurried certainty that was essentially his manner, and he stood beside the table and looked at Sheriff Purdy, and then at Theodore Crane, and then at the room full of people who were very suddenly looking back at him. "I knew Gerald Stiller for 15 years, Simon said, his voice carrying easily in the silent hall. "I knew him well enough to know that his mind was sound and his judgment was reliable and his decisions were his own. He told me himself in November of last year in front of 2 witnesses whose names I will provide in writing that he intended to leave his property to the woman who had come to care for his books and had treated him with genuine decency. He was not confused. He was not manipulated. He was a man who knew what he wanted and did what he intended." Theodore Crane had shifted in his front row seat. Sheriff Purdy's jaw had tightened. "Furthermore," Simon said, "I am prepared to state for the record that I am aware of payments made by Theodore Crane to the office of the county sheriff over the past 2 years, and I have documentation that will be provided to the state attorney's office in Topeka, which I have already contacted, along with a request for investigation." He reached inside his coat and removed a folded letter. "This is a letter from the state attorney's deputy confirming receipt of my initial complaint and informing me that an investigator will be traveling to Harrow Creek within the month." The room exploded, not all at once and not in the same direction. Some people were on their feet asking questions. Some were very carefully studying their shoes. Theodore Crane had gone the particular color of a man whose investment has just suffered a catastrophic loss, and Sheriff Purdy was making sounds in the direction of the county official that, from where Emma was sitting, looked very much like a man trying to renegotiate a position that had become untenable. Emma had sat very still through all of it, watching Simon stand at the front of that room with his straight back, and his steady voice and his folded letter from the state attorney, and she felt something happening in her chest that was too large and too compound to be just one emotion. He had not rescued her. The documents she had laid out had already been building the case. Clara Boyd's railroad records were already doing their work. The legal mechanism was already in motion. But in a room full of people who had chosen silence, Simon Walden had chosen to speak. He had put his name next to hers in front of everyone in the community, in the full knowledge of what Crane could do to his water access and his business relationships and his reputation, and he had done it with the same calm certainty he did everything. After the meeting, in the confusion of voices and the shuffling of people who were no longer sure which direction to stand in, Simon had made his way through the crowd to her side. He said nothing at first. He just stood next to her, and the simple geometry of that, his presence beside her in that room, meant something she was not sure language was large enough to contain. "The state attorney," she said. "Is that real?" "Every word of it," he said. "I contacted them 3 weeks ago. I've been waiting for the right moment to make it public." She looked at him. "3 weeks," she said. "I wanted to be certain it was in motion before I used it," he said. "It's not a bluff if it's a fact." She took his hand in the middle of that room with everyone still milling around them, and she held it. Several people saw. She did not care. Or rather, she did not care in the specific way that she had decided. She was done with caring what this town thought of her in the place where fear lived, though she remained quite capable of caring what it thought in the place where dignity lived. Simon looked down at her hand in his and then at her face, and what was in his expression was so unguarded and so warm that two of the women from the Civic Beautification Society who happened to be watching had to look quickly away, because it was, as one of them would later tell the other privately, a great deal to witness. The investigation came. The investigator from the state attorney's office, a precise man named Hargrove, arrived in Harrow Creek on the 12th of July and spent 8 days there. He reviewed the documents Simon had provided. He interviewed the witnesses to Gerald Stiller's conversations about his intentions. He examined the records of payments from Crane to the sheriff, which Simon had obtained through a source that he described only as someone in the county banking system who had a conscience and a tolerance for risk. He also interviewed Clara Boyd, who arrived with her railroad records and hotel ledgers, and methodically demolished every claim the challenge filing had made. Theodore Crane left town on the 3rd day of the investigation, which told everyone everything they needed to know about his confidence in its outcome. Sheriff Purdy stayed, because leaving would have been an admission, and he spent those 8 days looking increasingly like a man who has bet everything on a horse that is not going to finish. By the end of July, the results were unambiguous. The fraudulent challenge to Gerald Stiller's will was dismissed with a formal finding of bad faith. The deed to the Stiller property was confirmed as valid. Theodore Crane was indicted on charges of attempted fraud and corruption of a public official, and while the wheels of Kansas justice in 1882 moved with their own particular pace, the indictment was real and the outcome, Clara Boyd assured Emma, was not seriously in doubt. Sheriff Dale Purdy resigned his office on the 1st of August, which was preferable to being removed, and left Harrow Creek within the week. His replacement, a quiet man named Alderman who had previously served as a deputy in Dodge City, and who had the reputation of a person entirely uninterested in the enrichment of Theodore Crane, was appointed by the county commission and arrived in town without fanfare and without enemies. And Harrow Creek, as towns do when the political weather changes, adjusted. It was not a sudden transformation. It was not a wholesale reversal of every slight and silence of the past 8 months. But the banker ceased finding reasons to hold Emma's deposits. The dry goods store returned her credit account without explanation and without apology, both of which she would have found insulting if she had expected them. Carl Haynes came back to work at the Stiller property, because the bank loan that had been used to coerce him was no longer being called early, and he came with his hat in his hands and an expression of genuine remorse, and Emma had said simply, "I know why you left. Come back and let's not mention it again." 2 of the ranchers, who had dropped their water agreements, wrote letters asking to reinstate them. Emma considered those letters for several days, thinking about what accepting them meant and what refusing them meant, and in the end she accepted both, because the water was there and the agreements were fair and the alternative was pettiness, which she had never had much patience for. The women of the Civic Beautification Society remained cool to her, with the exception of a woman named Margaret Alderdis, who had never been entirely comfortable with the group's behavior, and who appeared at Emma's door one morning in August with a jar of preserves and a look of uncomfortable contrition, and who said, somewhat stiffly, that she thought Emma had handled herself with considerable fortitude, and that she was sorry for not having said so sooner. Emma had invited her in for coffee. They had talked for 2 hours and discovered a shared enthusiasm for correct accounting practices and a shared impatience with people who confused social standing with moral worth. And Margaret Alderdis became, over the following months, a genuine friend. The summer moved into its fullness, hot and wide and golden, and Emma ran the Stiller property with the competence and care she had always intended. And the water agreements were in order and the cattle were healthy, and the books were precise and everything was, by any measurable standard, exactly what she had come to Kansas for. And then there was Simon. Simon, who came to her property not 3 times a week now but most days, who had stopped pretending the visits were about fence lines or water agreements, and who arrived in the evenings and sat on the porch and talked with her about everything, about the land and the work and the larger world that existed beyond the immediate demands of both. Simon, who had taken to riding with her when she surveyed the property, who had learned the names of all her cattle in the easy way of someone who actually listened when you spoke to him. Simon, who kissed her in the long evening light with a warmth and deliberateness that still made her breath catch, every time, as if it were still something new. It was something new, she thought. That was the thing about it. It had the quality of newness not because it was unfamiliar but because it was, unlike anything she had previously called by the same names, entirely real. She had not been in love before, she understood now. Not the way this was. She had been in a marriage, which is a different thing, and she had felt things she called love that had been, on examination, a mixture of hope and effort and the particular human tendency to mistake intensity for meaning. What she felt for Simon Walden was quieter than that and considerably more powerful, the way deep water is quieter than rapids and immeasurably stronger. He felt it too, in his own precise way. She could see it in how he looked at her, in the quality of attention he gave her that was different from the quality of attention he gave everything else, which was itself already considerable. She could see it in the small, consistent acts of consideration that he performed without commentary, because Simon Walden was not a man who made declarations when actions were available. On a Saturday evening in the first week of September, with the summer beginning its slow withdrawal and the light carrying that particular quality of early autumn that makes everything look like a painting of itself, Simon had arrived at her door with something in his expression that was different. Not troubled, but held, the way a person holds something they are about to set down. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, which was where they had their most important conversations, because neither of them were people who required elaborate settings for serious things, and he put his hands flat on the table between them and looked at her with those October eyes. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "And I want to be clear that I'm asking you, not proposing a business arrangement or a social convenience, because I'm aware that those are the forms marriage often takes, and that your experience of it has made you appropriately cautious about the distinction. I'm asking because you are the person I want to spend my life with, and because I believe we would build something together that neither of us would build alone. And because I love you more entirely than I have loved anything." Emma sat very still. "That is the most thoroughly unromantic proposal I have ever heard," she said. "No," he said. "Is it accurate?" She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen around them was quiet, and the evening light came through the window and lay across the table between their hands, and Emma Merriweather, who had learned to be very careful about what she trusted and who she gave herself to, thought about caution and about courage, and about the difference between a risk you take because you are reckless and a risk you take because you have examined everything carefully and the answer is plain. "Yes," she said. "It's accurate. Then will you?" he asked. She reached out and covered his hands with hers. "Yes," she said, "I will." The smile that crossed his face then was something she had not seen before in its full form, unguarded and completely warm. The smile of a man who has carried a great deal of serious purpose for a long time, and is, in this moment, setting it down. She laughed because it transformed him, that smile. and because she was happy in a way that felt almost unfamiliar in its simplicity, and because Simon Walden, the most unhurried man in Harrow Creek, reached across the table and pulled her toward him with a certainty that left no room for doubt, and kissed her in the September kitchen light as though the rest of the world had agreed to wait. They were married in November, 1 year to the month after Emma Merriweather had arrived in Harrow Creek on a wagon that smelled of pine resin and wet wool, with a carpet bag and a contract and the dark past, and the hidden reserves and the complete, as yet unmet capacity for the kind of love that does not ask for guarantees. The ceremony was small and exact, performed by the new pastor, who had replaced the previous one when that gentleman's enthusiastic sermons about outsiders had been reviewed in the context of his relationship with the former sheriff's office, and attended by the people who had earned attendance, Clara Boyd and Margaret Alderdice and the Haynes brothers and their families, and 3 of Simon's ranch hands who had been with him for years, and who had, in their quiet, reliable way, always known what kind of man he was. Emma wore a dress the color of winter wheat, not white, because she was 27 years old and had a history and no interest in pretending otherwise, and she wore her hair down because Simon had once told her, in the particular offhand way he had of saying true things, that he thought it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and she had decided that was a reason to wear it down at her own wedding. Simon wore his good coat and looked at her when she walked toward him with the expression that Margaret Alderdice would later describe, with more emotion than she usually permitted herself, as the most open face she had ever seen on a man in that church, which was saying something because she had attended a great many weddings there. The vows they exchanged were the traditional ones, and Emma meant every word of them with the deliberateness of someone who had chosen them, not inherited them. And when Simon said his own vows, he said them looking straight at her, and his voice was steady, and his eyes were exactly the color of the Kansas sky in October. After the ceremony, which concluded with a reception at the Walden Ranch that was small in number and considerable in warmth, Simon and Emma stood on the porch of the house that was now theirs and looked out across the wide Kansas plain where the November grass had gone to gold and the last light was settling into the western edge of the sky. "Well," Simon said. "Well," Emma agreed. "Are you happy?" he asked, not anxiously but with the direct, honest curiosity he brought to all the important questions. She considered it because he would have thought less of a reflexive answer. "Yes," she said. Genuinely, fully, she looked at him. "Are you?" "More than I expected to be," he said, which for Simon Walden was the equivalent of a declaration of the most extravagant kind. Emma laughed and leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stood together in the growing dark with the satisfaction of 2 people who have made something real together. The winter was a working one, because winter on the Kansas plain was always a working one. But it was different from every previous winter of Emma's life in the specific and considerable way that all things are different when you do them in the presence of a person who sees you completely and chooses to stay. She combined the management of both properties, because it was the obvious and efficient thing to do, and the combined water rights and land made the Walden spread into something that even the most grudging observers in Harrow Creek had to acknowledge was formidably well run. She brought the same systematic precision to Simon's books that she had brought to Gerald Stiller's, which revealed 3 inefficiencies that, once corrected, improved the ranch's margin by enough to finance 2 additional wells before spring. Simon watched her work with the undisguised appreciation of a man who has found his precise complement, and when she presented her findings, he asked exactly the right questions, and when she answered them, he implemented her recommendations without the defensiveness that many men would have felt at being told their own operation needed correction. "You're not bothered," she observed one evening, "by the fact that I found things you'd missed." "Why would I be?" he said. "I brought you in to find them. It would be a strange position to resent the competence I went looking for." She looked at him with what she now recognized as her particular expression of affection for him, which involved the slight raising of her brows and the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile. "You are a genuinely unusual man," she told him. "I've been told," he said. The legal proceedings against Theodore Crane concluded in the spring of 1883, as Clara Boyd had predicted they would. Crane was convicted of attempted fraud and official corruption, fined substantially, and barred from conducting land business in the state of Kansas. He departed for parts unknown, with considerably less than he had arrived with, which satisfied Emma with the precise satisfaction of a correctly balanced ledger. The Stiller property, which Emma had never legally separated from her own management, was formally integrated into the Walden Ranch holdings, with a specific legal provision that made clear the water rights remained under Emma's management in perpetuity, a provision that Simon had suggested, and that their lawyer had recorded with Clara Boyd's assistance, because Simon Walden was, among other qualities, the kind of man who understood that the structures around a thing should match the substance of it. Spring of 1883 came in bright and wide and generous, with a water table that the winter snows had replenished, and a cattle market that the Abilene buyers were calling the best in 3 years. Emma rode out every morning on the bay horse she had purchased with her first winter income, across the combined properties that she had fought for and kept, and now ran with the confidence of someone who has tested her own capacity and found it more than equal to the demand. She was, she knew, beginning to be happy in the deep structural way, not the temporary elation of a problem solved, but the steady warmth of a life that fit, that had been built correctly on accurate foundations. She was 30 years old, and she was in love with a man who was her equal and her complement, and who never once made her feel that her intelligence was an inconvenience or her history a liability. On a Tuesday morning in April, she stood in the kitchen making coffee and looked at herself with the objective honesty she tried to bring to all assessments, and understood that she was going to need to tell Simon something. He came in from the early chores with the scent of grass and horses about him and poured himself coffee and looked at her face and said immediately, "What is it?" "I think," she said carefully, "I may be with child." He set down his coffee cup. His expression did not change dramatically, because that was not his nature, but something in it became very still and then very warm, like a room when a fire is just lit. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Not entirely," she said, "but considerably. I've been tracking certain things, and the timing and the symptoms are consistent." "Should we go to Doc Alderman?" he asked. Doc Alderman had replaced the previous physician, who had been another of Purdy's social circle, and had found sudden reasons to relocate when the investigation arrived. "Yes," she said, "but I wanted to tell you first." He crossed the kitchen to her and put his hands on her face very gently, with the careful warmth he had when something moved him beyond his usual precision. "Emma," he said. "Don't say something sentimental," she said, but her voice was not steady. "I was going to say that I am the luckiest man in Harrow Creek," he said, "which is factually accurate and only incidentally sentimental." She put her hands over his. "We're going to be impossible at this," she said. "We're going to be excellent at this," he said, with the quiet confidence he brought to all assessments of their shared capacity. She laughed, and the laugh turned slightly unsteady, and he pulled her in and held her in the April kitchen with the smell of coffee and the early light coming through the window, and they stayed like that for a long time, two people on the verge of becoming something more than they had been. Doc Alderman confirmed it in May. A child, due in November, which Emma noted with a private sense of symmetry, would arrive almost exactly 2 years after she had come to Harrow Creek with a carpetbag and a dark past, and a capacity for love she had not yet fully understood. She told Clara Boyd, who had become a genuine friend in the way that women become friends when they have fought side by side, and who responded with the directness Emma had always loved in her. "Good. You'll be a terrifying mother. The child will be extraordinary," she told Margaret Alderdice, who cried, which surprised them both. And she rode out every morning through the long summer with the Kansas sky enormous above her, and the grass rolling in the wind, and her properties in order, and her books balanced, and her husband's voice in the morning, and the steady deepening warmth in her chest that was the thing she had spent too many years without a name for. The child was born in the last days of October in the year 1883 at the Walden Ranch, with Doc Alderman and Margaret Alderdis in attendance, and Simon Walden in the kitchen, which was where the doctor had firmly placed him, though he had been to the door twice and been returned twice with a look that brooked no argument. When the doctor came out and told him he had a son, Simon sat very still for a moment and then walked back to the bedroom and stood in the doorway looking at Emma in the bed with the small, red-faced, furious infant in her arms. And his face did the thing it had done on their wedding day, that full, unguarded opening that he so rarely allowed. "Come here," Emma said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the small face of his son, who had dark hair like Emma's, and was expressing an opinion about the world with considerable vocal authority. "He's going to be difficult," Simon said. "He's going to be wonderful," Emma corrected, "though possibly both." They named him Gerald for the old man who had, in his precise and quiet way, set everything in motion by trusting a woman he barely knew with everything he had. Gerald James Walden grew through his first year with the same blunt energy he had displayed from his initial arrival, opinionated and vigorous, and deeply attached to both his parents in the uncomplicated way of a child, who has never had reason to doubt that he is securely held. Simon was, as Emma had fully expected, exactly the father his nature had always implied he would be, steady and present and consistent, the kind of father whose children know precisely where they stand because the signals have never contradicted each other. He carried the baby on early morning inspections of the ranch with the same comfortable ease he brought to everything, and Gerald, from his vantage point on his father's shoulder, regarded the wide Kansas plain with the particular imperious satisfaction of someone who has not yet learned that he does not own it. Emma ran the combined properties, raised her son, read voraciously from the growing collection of books that Simon brought back from Topeka and Abilene on cattle drives, and was, in the full and measurable sense of the word, thriving. The town of Harrow Creek had largely made its peace with her, in the practical, unsentimental way of communities that have been shown their own worst face and prefer not to dwell on the memory. The merchants were cordial. The banker was deferential in a way that she found slightly amusing. Sheriff Alderman tipped his hat whenever they passed on the street. And the women who had cold-shouldered her through the previous winter were now entirely willing to acknowledge the evident fact that Emma Walden was one of the most competent people in the county, and that this was perhaps not something to continue resenting. It was not a perfect reconciliation, and Emma did not require one. She was not a woman who needed the town to love her. She needed it to deal with her fairly, which it now largely did, and that was sufficient. In the second year of their marriage, Simon came home from a cattle run to Abilene with a letter that had been forwarded through the shipping office. It was from a lawyer in Cincinnati, notifying Emma that Henry Merriweather had died of a fever the previous spring, and that there was a small sum in a savings account that had been in both their names from the marriage and which, under the terms of his estate, was to be disbursed to her. Emma read the letter twice and then sat with it for a while, not grieving exactly, because there was nothing left to grieve for but acknowledging. Henry Merriweather had been a central character in the story of her life for several important years, and his death was the final closing of a door that had been shut for a long time but not until now locked. She told Simon about it that evening, plainly and completely, as she told him everything. He listened and said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "More than all right. But it's strange to realize that a thing you thought was the most important thing that ever happened to you has become just one of the things that happened." "Perspective," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "Or maybe just time, or maybe just this." She gestured, meaning the kitchen and the ranch, and Gerald asleep in the next room, and Simon himself, all of it together as the weight on the other side of the scale. He reached across and took her hand, the same simple gesture he had made in the Harrow Creek town hall, and held it with the same warmth and certainty. "This," he agreed. The years arranged themselves with the particular goodness of years that are lived correctly, with work and purpose, and the genuine company of a person who suits you completely. Gerald was 2, and then 3, and then an astonishing and very loud 4, with opinions about horses and an attachment to a spotted dog named Copper who followed him everywhere with the unwavering devotion of an animal who has found his person. In the spring of 1886, Emma told Simon she was expecting again. He had been sitting on the porch in the early morning, going over the season's planting schedule, and she had come out with coffee and told him, and he had set the papers down and looked at her with the same quality of stillness and warmth as before and said, "How are you feeling?" "Well," she said, "better than last time so far. Less of the morning unpleasantness." "Good," he said, and pulled her down to sit beside him, and they sat together in the spring morning with the wide Kansas day beginning around them and Gerald's voice audible from inside the house, arguing with Copper about something with the complete seriousness of a 4-year-old. "Do you want a daughter?" she asked. He considered. "I want a healthy child," he said, "and I think you would be a magnificent mother to a daughter." "I think you would be a magnificent father to one," she said. The second child arrived in November, as the first cold of early winter was settling in, and was, to no one's particular surprise given the pattern of these things, another boy. They named him Thomas, for Simon's father, and he arrived with far more equanimity than Gerald had and immediately fell asleep, which Emma took as an encouraging sign. Gerald, who had been briefed on the situation with the thoroughness of a child who expects to be treated as a competent person, examined his new brother with the serious frown of an assessor, declared him very small, and went back outside to inform Copper of the development. Thomas Walden proved to be, as his initial composure suggested, a contemplative soul, a quiet observer who watched the world with large dark eyes and processed what he saw before responding to it, which was a quality that made him, Emma told Simon one evening, unmistakably his father's son. Simon had looked at Thomas in his arms and said, with the private warmth he kept for these moments, "He has your eyes." "He has both our eyes," Emma said. "He got the best of both." Their life at the Walden Ranch had become, by the mid-1880s, something that they had built with intention and tended with care, and that reflected accurately who they both were. The ranch was well run and prosperous, not because they had been lucky, but because they were competent, and because they worked together in the complementary way of two people whose respective abilities fit together without overlap or gap. Emma's reputation in the county had long since shifted from suspicious outsider to essential figure, which amused her in its completeness, because she had not changed. The town had changed, or rather the town had had its vision corrected by events and had adjusted accordingly. Clara Boyd came out from the county seat twice yearly, and stayed for a week, and they talked about law and land, and the particular pleasures and frustrations of being a woman who insisted on being taken seriously in a world that required regular reminding. Margaret Alderdis became a fixture at the ranch's Sunday dinners, and was Gerald's favorite adult outside his parents, a distinction he had conferred on her after she beat him at checkers 12 times in a row, and had not softened the victories a single point. In the evenings, after the children were asleep and the work of the day was done, Emma and Simon sat on the porch the way they had when everything was still uncertain and the stakes were still high, and talked with the same ease and depth they had always had, except that now the ease was richer because it was built on 4 years, then 5, then 6, of accumulated knowing. They talked about the land and what they were building on it. They talked about the boys and what they hoped for them. They talked about the country, which was changing rapidly in these years, with railroads reaching into places that had been wilderness, and with the cattle drives becoming something different as fencing spread across the open range, and with the old Wild West that both of them had known in their own ways becoming something more settled and more complicated. "Is that sad?" Simon asked her one evening, watching the sunset that lay its enormous colors across the horizon. "The closing of all this." Emma thought about it. "The open range had its romance," she said, "and also its injustices. The things that close are not only the beautiful things." He looked at her. "No," he said, "that's right. I think what matters," she said, "is what gets built in the space that opens up, not who we were out here but who we become." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "You have made this ranch into something better than it would have been without you." "We have made it," she said. "Yes," he conceded, "but you know what I mean." She knew what he meant. She took his hand. "I know," she said. In the autumn of 1887, Harrow Creek held a county fair, the first significant public gathering it had attempted since the legal upheavals of 1882, and Emma was on the organizing committee, not because she had sought the position, but because Margaret Alderdice and 3 other women had shown up at her door in July and informed her that she was going to be on it, and she had found it genuinely impossible to argue with the collective certainty of 4 women who have made up their minds. The fair was a considerable success. Gerald Walden, who was by now 6 years old and deeply opinionated about horses, entered his pony in the children's riding competition and won 3rd place, and was briefly incandescent with pleasure, and briefly devastated that he had not won first. These 2 states succeeding each other in the way of small children who have not yet learned to moderate their emotional registers. Emma stood with Simon at the edge of the field, watching their son manage his feelings about 3rd place with more composure than might have been expected, and she felt the particular combination of amusement and love and private pride that parents feel when their children surprise them in a good direction. "He's going to be all right," Simon said. "He's going to be formidable," Emma said. "Which is better?" Thomas, who was 1 year old and riding in Margaret Alderdice's arms, was completely absorbed in eating a piece of corn bread and entirely indifferent to the proceedings, which was very on character. In the evening, when the fair was winding down and the families were beginning the slow process of gathering children and animals and the various items they had acquired, and the great Kansas sky was doing what it did in October with the light, Emma found herself standing alone for a moment at the edge of the fairground, looking out at the wide, flat country that she had come to by accident and stayed in by choice and made, over 5 years, into something she recognized as home. She thought about the woman who had arrived on that wagon in November of 1881, with a carpetbag and a contract and a careful, measured life, and she thought about everything that had had to happen, the betrayal and the public accusation, and the silence of a room full of people who would not speak for her, and the 1 pair of boots on the wooden floor, and the voice that had spoken her name when no other voice would. She thought about how much had depended on that moment. Not just the legal outcome, which Clara Boyd had been building toward regardless, but the other thing, the thing that was harder to quantify and more essential, the understanding that there was a person in the world who saw her accurately and fully and chose to stand beside her in the clearest possible terms. She had thought she needed to fight alone, because alone was what she had been trained to be by everything that had happened before. She had been wrong. Not because she could not fight alone. She could and she had and she would have managed, but because fighting alone was not the only option, and it was not the best one. And knowing the difference was its own kind of knowledge, harder one and more valuable than most. Simon found her there, as he generally found her when she had gone quiet, by the simple method of looking for the place where she had last been and following the direction of her thinking. He came and stood beside her and looked out at the same horizon. "All right," he asked. "Very much so," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into the solid warmth of him, and they stood at the edge of the fairground in the last light of an October day in 1887, in Harrow Creek, Kansas, with their children safe behind them and the land spreading out before them in every direction, vast and honest and abundantly theirs. The stars were beginning to appear, the first few shy and then more, and then the whole enormous sky filling slowly with them, the way the Kansas sky filled with everything, generously, without reserve, as though it had been holding this all day and was finally at liberty to let it go. "I have something to tell you," Emma said. He looked down at her. She felt rather than saw his attention sharpen in the way it always did when she prefaced something this way. "We're expecting again," she said. He was quiet for a moment that she had learned to read correctly, the stillness of a man absorbing something real. Then he said, "When?" "Spring," she said. "Late March, perhaps April." "How are you feeling?" he asked, which was always his first question because it was always the right first question. "Perfectly well," she said. "Better than either of the last times, actually. I think I may have simply got better at it." He laughed quietly, and the laugh was so warm and so completely his that it made her smile against his shoulder. "A third," he said. "A third," she confirmed. "Gerald is going to have opinions," he said. "Gerald has opinions about everything," she said. "It's one of his most reliable qualities." He pressed his lips to her hair, the way he had done since the first autumn when she had walked into his arms on that porch, and held her in the darkening evening with the complete warmth of a man who is precisely where he intends to be. The third child arrived in April of 1888, a girl, pink and fierce and extraordinarily vocal about her preferences from her very first moments, and they named her Ruth, which was Emma's choice, though Simon had hesitated slightly at the name, and Emma had looked at him and said, "She was a woman who left where she came from and built something better. I find that admirable." He had smiled and said, "Then Ruth it is." Gerald examined his new sister with the evaluative thoroughness of an older brother who has opinions, determined that she was louder than Thomas had been, which he considered an improvement, and immediately established himself as her most devoted defender, a role he took with a seriousness that made both his parents' hearts considerably larger. Thomas observed his sister with his usual contemplative calm, and then gave her his considered opinion in the form of a very small pat on her head, which was his equivalent of a formal welcome, and which Emma preserved in her journal as one of the most precisely Thomas things Thomas had ever done. The Walden Ranch in the spring of 1888 was, by any measure that mattered, a place built on love and competence and the kind of honest foundations that hold through all the seasons that a Kansas plain can produce. The books were in order. The cattle were healthy. The water rights were secure and documented and entirely unambiguous. The house had been expanded twice, once for Gerald's birth and once for Thomas's, and would need expanding again for Ruth, which Simon had already begun drawing plans for in the mornings before the household woke. Emma stood at the window on a morning in May, with the wide Kansas spring outside and Ruth in her arms and Gerald's voice audible from the yard, where he was instructing his pony on some matter of great importance, and she thought about what her life had cost and what it had given her in return. It had cost her a marriage that should never have happened, and a divorce that should not have been necessary, and a reputation in one city that had been carefully dismantled, and a journey across several states to a hired position managing a dying man's books in a town that had not wanted her. It had cost her the particular loneliness of a person who is competent enough to manage alone and therefore spends too long managing alone, because competence can look like contentment from the outside, and not everyone thinks to look more carefully. It had given her a piece of land on the Kansas plain that she had fought for and kept. It had given her a man who had stood up in a room full of silence and spoken her name. It had given her Gerald and Thomas and Ruth, and the particular daily satisfaction of a life lived without pretense, in full honesty with the person who knew her best. It had given her the thing she had not known she was looking for when she left Cincinnati with a carpetbag and a carefully controlled face, and the conviction that she would handle whatever came. She had handled it, and it had been more than handling. It had been, in the end, the full and particular joy of a life that fit. Simon came in from the morning chores and stopped in the doorway of the kitchen, looking at her at the window with Ruth against her shoulder in the May light. And his face did the thing it had been doing since a Saturday evening in September when he had put his hands flat on a table and asked her to marry him, that full, open warmth that he kept mostly for her. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her carefully because of Ruth, and then looked at the baby with the expression he had for all their children, that particular combination of wonder and responsibility and complete unguarded love. "She looks like you today," he said. "She looks like you," Emma said. "She has your stubbornness." "That's not a quality I'm aware of possessing," he said, with the absolute straightness of someone making an untenable position. "I know," Emma said warmly. "That's the most stubborn thing about it." He laughed fully, the laugh she had loved from the first time she heard it, and the Kansas morning continued around them, warm and wide and abundantly, simply good. Clara Boyd came for a visit that summer and brought news of the legal world and 2 new books, and a tart opinion about the current political situation in the state, and they sat on the porch in the long evening and talked with the ease of women who have been through something real together and emerged from it into friendship. Clara looked around at the ranch and the children and Simon out in the yard with Gerald and Thomas and said, with the directness that had never once softened, "You know, when I first took your case, I thought the legal situation was the whole of it." "It wasn't," Emma said. "No," Clara agreed. "It turns out the legal situation was merely the occasion." She looked at Emma sideways. "You built something good here." "We did," Emma said. "You did," Clara said firmly, in the way that Clara said things when she was absolutely certain. "You came here with nothing but your own competence and the determination to hold what was rightfully yours, and you held it, and everything that grew from it grew from that." Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't do it alone." "Nobody worthwhile does anything alone," Clara said. "But the point is you were worth doing it alongside." She paused and then added, in the slightly softer register she used when she was saying something true that she didn't usually permit herself, "I'm very glad you stayed." "So am I," Emma said. The evening deepened and the stars came out over Harrow Creek, Kansas. The same stars that had been there in November of 1881 when a wagon came in from the east, and a woman climbed down with a carpetbag and a careful face, and a life in need of everything that was still ahead of her. The same stars that had watched a room full of silence, and one pair of boots on a wooden floor, and a voice that spoke a name that changed the shape of a story. Emma Walden sat on the porch of the ranch she had fought for and kept, with her children asleep inside and her husband's hand warm in hers and her friend beside her, and the wide Kansas night doing what it always did, filling completely with everything it had, holding nothing back. She was home. She had always been capable of it. She had simply needed the right place and the right person and the right moment when someone chose to stand up and say, plainly and certainly, in front of everyone who had stayed silent, that she was known, and she was valued, and she was not alone. She squeezed Simon's hand. He squeezed back. And the stars kept their watch over the Kansas plain, over the Walden Ranch and the water rights and the correctly balanced books and the sleeping children, and the 2 people on the porch who had found each other in the middle of the worst kind of trouble and had built, out of that unlikely material, something that would last.